Welcome to Made for More, a podcast where we dive into all things faith, ministry, and everything in between. My hope is that through these conversations, you'll be reminded that you were made on purpose and for a purpose. Whether you're navigating your faith, leading in ministry, or just looking for encouragement in everyday life, this space is for you. With that in mind, let's jump into today's episode of Made for More. All right. Well, thanks again for joining for another episode. As we start out, I would love to begin by asking you guys a question. See, why do we walk through seasons of waiting? I personally believe that waiting is one of the hardest seasons we can walk through, yet it is something that every believer will experience at some point in life. Whether you're waiting for a relationship to be restored, a prayer to be answered, or for a door to open in your career, tension of waiting can honestly feel unbearable. And here's the thing, in those moments, it's easy to wonder, what is God doing? Does he even hear me? Or is he even working? See, we tend to see waiting as a negative, frustrating experience, one where we feel sidelined or even abandoned. But what if waiting is not just a pause in our journey, but an essential part of God's plan for us? What if through the waiting, God is shaping and preparing us for what's next? In my own life, I've walked through many seasons of waiting, times where relationships have ended, where I've waited for answers to prayer, and times where I've hoped for doors to open that never did. Each season brought a unique challenge, and through it all, I've learned something crucial. See, waiting is not a passive experience. It's an active, refining, and sometimes painful process that allows God to do his most profound work in us. See, we tend to be so quick to ask God to change our situations, not realizing that sometimes he's using the situations to change us. Waiting often reveals areas of our hearts that need refining, places where we've held too tightly to our own desires or dreams. It can be easy to want our circumstances to shift simply because they're uncomfortable or because they don't align with what we envision for ourselves. But what if those very circumstances are the tools God is using to prepare us for what's ahead? There have been many things in my life that I've wanted so desperately, but had to let go in order for God to help me grow closer to him. In the waiting, I was honestly humbled and had to die to a lot of my desires, and I still do. See, looking back, I realized that some of the things I thought that I wanted most had become idols in my heart, things I clung to more tightly than I clung to God. The letting go was really painful, but it was in that surrender that God drew me closer to him and aligned my heart with his. The reality is that we often struggle with waiting because it feels like we're not in control. We want things to happen on our timeline, and when they don't, we start to question God's goodness. The pain of waiting can make us believe we are being punished or that something is wrong with us. We may even feel forgotten by God. But in reality, it's in these seasons of waiting that we experience his presence more intimately and his purposes more deeply. Waiting is often where we are most humbled and dependent on the Lord. One of the hardest seasons I've learned is that waiting is never wasted. Even when it feels like nothing is happening, God is moving in ways we cannot see. Waiting allows God to strip away our self-reliance and build in us a greater dependence on him. It teaches us to trust his timing, even when it doesn't align with our own. I've seen this truth play out in my own journey, especially when it comes to relationships. The end of one relationship after another left me questioning not just what was wrong with me, but also what God's plan was for my life. There were times I doubted if I would ever even find a meaningful relationship, and I certainly wasn't prepared for the waiting season that came after. But those seasons thus far have taught me something I could never have learned otherwise, that my desires and God's plan are often not the same. And while it's painful to see the things we want slip through our fingers, it's in those moments that we grow most deeply in our trust in God. Through those breakups, I've learned that waiting humbles me. It teaches me that sometimes what I want is not what God has in mind, and his plans are far better than mine. In my own life, I had a picture of how my timeline was supposed to look, but it didn't match up with God's. I thought that following my desires would lead to happiness, but instead, following God's path, though harder, has led to more peace, deeper character, and faith that would never have been built without those times of waiting. It's also in the waiting that I've learned to wrestle with questions that have shaped my faith. Do I trust God when things aren't going my way? Do I believe He is good, even when I don't understand His plan? Let's be honest here. These are really hard questions, but they're the ones that lead us to deeper intimacy with God. See, Scripture is filled with stories of individuals who faced long seasons of waiting. Their stories remind us that waiting is not a punishment, but a part of God's process to prepare us for something greater. Abraham and Sarah waited for the promise of a child, a promise that took years, decades to come to fruition. Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. This long season of waiting tested their faith, but in the end, God's promise came at the perfect time, not a moment too soon or a moment too late. Abraham's faith was refined during those years, and Isaac's birth was not just the fulfillment of a promise, it was the confirmation of God's faithfulness. The waiting season was part of the process that deepened their trust in God. Similarly, Joseph experienced years of waiting. After being sold into slavery by his brothers, Joseph spent years in Egypt, falsely accused of crime he didn't commit, and waiting for God to fulfill his dreams for Joseph's life. Joseph spent time in prison, but in the waiting season, God was refining him for the leadership role he would eventually step into. Joseph learned that God's timing, even when it seemed delayed, was always right. David, too, was anointed king of Israel as a young man, but it was years before he actually took the throne. During this waiting period, David faced incredible trials and challenges. He was pursued by King Saul, faced the loneliness of the wilderness, and battled with doubt and fear. Yet in those moments of waiting, David grew in his trust in God and in his leadership abilities, ultimately becoming one of Israel's greatest kings. See, these stories remind us that God is never idle in our waiting. He is always working, preparing, and shaping us for what's ahead. One of the most powerful lessons I've learned in the season of waiting is the importance of surrender. Waiting forces us to let go of our need for control and trust that God's plan is better than our own. It's not easy to surrender our timeline, but it's essential if we want to experience the fullness of God's purpose for our lives. Romans 8:28 reminds us that God works all things together for the good of those who love Him. But sometimes that good takes time to unfold, and it requires us to trust Him in that process. In the moments of waiting, I've often prayed the words of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, "Not my will, but yours be done." See, I think this prayer of surrender is not just about accepting God's timeline. It's about aligning our hearts with His purposes. Isaiah 40:31 says, "But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint." See, even in seasons of waiting, God promises to renew our strength. He promises that our waiting is not wasted. It's an investment in something deeper. So when you find yourself in the waiting, remember that your time is not being wasted. God is working in the unseen. He is preparing you, refining you, and making you more dependent on Him. The strength you are gaining in the wait will equip you for what's ahead. As you reflect on your own seasons of waiting, I want to give you 3 key takeaways to help you navigate the waiting with purpose and trust. See, number 1 is embrace the growth in the wait. Waiting isn't just about the end result. It's about what God is doing in you during the process. Ask yourself, what is God trying to teach me in this season? Whether it's patience, trust, or surrender, God is refining something in you that will be crucial for the next season of your life. Number 2, surrender your timeline to God. The hardest part of waiting often comes from our desire to control the timing. But God's timing is perfect, even when it feels slow. I encourage you to pray the prayer of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, saying, "Not my will, but yours be done." And trust that God has a purpose in every delay. And lastly, number 3, find hope in his faithfulness. Waiting can be discouraging, but take heart in knowing that God is always faithful. He's working behind the scenes even when you can't see it. Trust that the wait is not wasted and that what he has in store for you will be worth every moment. See, waiting is hard, but it's never wasted. It's a season where God does his most profound work in us, shaping us for his purposes and drawing us closer to his heart. When the waiting finally ends, we often find that God has given us something far greater than we could have ever imagined. So, hold on to hope, trust in his timing, and know that he is faithful. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Made for More. My prayer is that today's conversation encouraged you, challenged you, and reminded you that God has created you with purpose and intention. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, share it with a friend, or leave a review. Until next time, remember, you were made for more. So live with purpose and trust God in the journey. See you next time.